The ballroom fell completely silent the moment the soldier pointed his finger at her. Every eye in that elegantly decorated hall turned toward the woman standing near the entrance, dressed in a perfectly pressed army service uniform adorned with ribbons, badges, and rank insignia that made several guests visibly uncomfortable. She stood still, spine straight, chin level, hands relaxed at her sides, the picture of composure in a room that had suddenly turned hostile. The young soldier who had confronted her was nearly trembling with self-righteous certainty, his voice cutting through the soft orchestral music that had been playing moments before. "Arrest her," he said loudly, his eyes sweeping the crowd for backup. "She's an imposter. No woman holds that rank. Someone call security." The murmuring began immediately, rippling through the assembled officers, spouses, and dignitaries like a current through still water. Some reached for their phones. Some leaned toward their neighbors with whispered speculation. A few junior officers actually moved toward her, hands instinctively reaching for authority they didn't quite have in a formal setting. And through all of it, she never flinched. Not once. Because she had been here before, in different rooms, on different days, facing different versions of the same doubt wearing different uniforms. What happened next when the commanding general crossed the room, took one look at her identification card, and turned to face the crowd, would be a moment that nobody in that ballroom would ever forget. And it raises a question worth thinking about deeply. How many times must a person prove themselves before the world finally accepts what was always true? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this story is about far more than one evening at a military ball. Her name was Lieutenant Colonel Daria Holt, and she had spent exactly 22 years earning every single thread on the uniform she wore that evening. She had not arrived at that ballroom seeking admiration or attention. She had arrived because her brigade commander had personally requested her presence at the annual Founders' Day Gala, an event held each year to honor the history and traditions of the division. It was the kind of evening that meant dress uniforms, polished medals, formal greetings, and carefully choreographed military courtesies. It was not the kind of evening Daria typically enjoyed, but she respected the tradition and she respected her commander, so she had driven the 40 minutes from post, parked carefully to avoid door dings on her car, and walked into that lobby carrying 22 years of service on her chest and absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. She had grown up in a small town in eastern Tennessee, the youngest of 4 children raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a regional hospital while managing to attend every school event her children ever participated in. Daria had watched her mother carry invisible weight with visible grace her entire childhood, and she had filed that lesson away somewhere deep in her character long before she ever knew she would need it. She was not the girl anyone predicted would join the army. She was quiet in school, more comfortable with books than crowds, more likely to be found at the library than at Friday night games. But she had a quality that teachers noticed and struggled to name, a kind of inner steadiness, a calm that did not shrink under pressure. When she was 17, her high school hosted a military career day. An army recruiter spoke for 20 minutes about service, discipline, and purpose. Daria sat in the third row and felt something click into place inside her chest like a key turning a lock. She enlisted at 18 and immediately distinguished herself in basic combat training, not by being the loudest or the fastest, but by being the most consistent. She never quit when tasks became uncomfortable. She never complained when conditions became difficult. She helped the soldiers around her when it cost her time she didn't have to spare, and she did it without being asked. Her drill sergeants noticed. Her peers noticed. And slowly, the army noticed. She was nominated for officer candidate school after 4 years of enlisted service, a path that required her to essentially rebuild her identity from the ground up. She went from being Specialist Holt, a soldier who followed orders with excellence, to Second Lieutenant Holt, a leader responsible for the welfare and performance of soldiers who were sometimes older, sometimes larger, and sometimes far more skeptical than she was. That transition was not graceful. It was not easy. It was, in fact, one of the hardest things she had ever done in her life. But she did it the same way she did everything else, with steady, quiet, unrelenting effort applied every single day regardless of how she felt or what the room thought of her. She had earned her commission not by exception but by excellence, and she had never stopped earning it in the 20 years since. The years between commissioning and that ballroom were not a highlight reel. They were a long, demanding, frequently humbling education delivered through deployments, leadership challenges, personal losses, and the specific exhaustion that comes from caring deeply about a mission that never fully pauses. Daria's first deployment came 3 years into her career, a 9-month rotation to a forward operating base where the conditions were austere and the threat environment required constant alertness. She was a platoon leader at the time, responsible for 31 soldiers and their daily operations, their equipment readiness, their morale, and their safety. She had trained for this. She believed she was prepared. She was also wrong in a dozen important ways that she would only recognize in retrospect. Leadership in a garrison environment, she quickly discovered, was entirely different from leadership in a deployed environment. The paperwork pressures and scheduling conflicts of peacetime duty gave way to something rawer and more immediate. Her soldiers were tired, separated from their families, operating under rules of engagement they sometimes questioned, and looking to her for a steadiness she had to manufacture on days when she didn't feel it naturally. There was one particular week early in the deployment when 3 of her soldiers received bad news from home in rapid succession: a divorce filing, a father's cancer diagnosis, and the death of a newborn. The collective grief in her platoon was palpable and heavy. Daria sat with each of those soldiers individually, not as their officer, but as a human being who understood that service did not pause personal pain. She made no speeches. She offered no solutions she didn't have. She simply showed up for them the way her mother had always shown up for her children, consistently and without keeping score. That approach, practical empathy paired with unwavering mission focus, became the signature of her leadership style over the years that followed. She moved through assignments at the battalion, brigade, and eventually division level, taking on increasingly complex responsibilities and developing a reputation as someone who could stabilize struggling units without breaking the people inside them. She had been deployed 3 times in total, spending over 30 months in theater across her career. She had been awarded the Bronze Star, not for a single dramatic act, but for sustained performance under pressure during a particularly difficult rotation in which her unit maintained operational effectiveness through equipment failures, personnel shortfalls, and a threat environment that required daily adaptation. The citation was formal and measured in the way military language tends to be, but the soldiers who served under her during that period understood what it meant in human terms. It meant she had held the line when holding the line was genuinely hard. She had also paid personal prices that the uniform does not formally acknowledge. She had missed her mother's surgery because she was downrange and unable to leave. She had ended a serious relationship when the man she was with told her, gently but honestly, that he needed someone who could be present in ways the Army did not permit. She had spent holidays in dining facilities with soldiers far from home, choosing to be present for them in a way that meant being absent from everything else. These were not regrets exactly, but they were costs, real and accumulated over 2 decades, paid voluntarily by someone who believed deeply in what the service asked of her. The evening of the Founders' Day Gala began without incident. Daria arrived at the hotel where the event was being held and made her way through the lobby with the unhurried confidence of someone entirely comfortable in their own skin. She checked her uniform in the mirror near the coat check, verified that her medals were aligned correctly, adjusted her beret, and walked into the ballroom. It was a beautiful space, high ceilings draped in soft lighting, round tables dressed in white linen, a small orchestra playing near the far wall, and several hundred people moving through the early cocktail hour in their finest dress. She recognized some faces immediately: fellow officers, senior NCOs in their dress blues, civilian dignitaries, a few retired generals whose photographs she had seen in unit histories. She exchanged greetings with a brigadier general she had worked with during a joint exercise 2 years prior and was making her way toward the seating chart when she felt someone staring. She had developed a sensitivity to that particular sensation over the years, the feeling of being assessed, weighed, and found suspicious by someone who had made a rapid decision based entirely on incomplete information. She turned and found the source immediately: a young captain, perhaps 28 years old, wearing dress blues with the polished eagerness of someone early enough in his career to still confuse confidence with certainty. He was looking at her rank, then at her ribbons, then at her face, then back at her rank, cycling through the sequence with increasing agitation in his expression. She recognized the calculation happening behind his eyes, and she felt something tired and familiar settle in her chest. Not anger. Not quite. Something more like weariness mixed with patience. The kind of emotion you develop when you have had the same experience enough times that it no longer surprises you, but still costs something each time. She walked past him toward the seating chart. He followed. She found her name at a table near the head of the room, assigned, she noticed, directly adjacent to the commanding general's table. She was reading the table arrangement when she heard his voice behind her, louder than the situation required. Shaped with the particular edge of a man who had convinced himself he was doing something important. He announced that her rank and awards were inconsistent with what he expected to see on a female officer of any age and demanded to know which unit she was assigned to. She turned to face him fully and told him calmly that she was Lieutenant Colonel Daria Holt, assigned to the division's operations staff, and that he was welcome to verify her identification if he had genuine concerns. Instead of accepting that answer, he raised his voice further and called for security, declaring to the room at large that she was an imposter who had somehow obtained a uniform she had no right to wear. The orchestra faded. The conversation stopped. Every person in the ballroom turned to look at her, and Daria Holt stood in the center of that silence and did not move a single unnecessary muscle. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like anything from the outside. It doesn't involve charging a position or pulling someone from danger. It involves standing perfectly still in a room full of doubting eyes and choosing not to shrink, not to perform, not to explain yourself beyond what the moment requires, and trusting that truth does not need to shout to be heard. That was the courage Daria exercised in those long seconds while the captain's accusation hung in the air of the ballroom and the assembled guests formed their silent opinions around her. She was aware of the security personnel moving toward the edges of the room. She was aware of the whispers and the stares and the weight of 100 strangers' assumptions pressing against her from every direction. She held her ground and said nothing more than she had already said, because she had learned long ago that explaining yourself to someone who has already decided not to believe you is an investment with no return. What she did instead was make direct, unhurried eye contact with the captain and wait. That was all. She simply waited with the stillness of someone who has nothing to fear from scrutiny and everything to gain from patience. The captain, uncomfortable with that stillness, spoke again, louder and with more flourish. Turning to address the security personnel who had arrived at the perimeter of the small drama unfolding near the seating chart. He was building momentum, the way people do when they've made a public commitment to a position they haven't fully thought through. And every additional word he spoke was a brick added to a wall he would eventually have to tear down himself. It was at this precise moment that Major General Thomas Carraway crossed the room. He was the commanding general of the division, a tall man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and the economy of movement that comes from decades of discipline. He had been watching from across the ballroom since the first rise in volume, and he moved through the crowd not quickly enough to suggest alarm, but not slowly enough to suggest indifference. When he reached the small circle that had formed around Daria and the captain, he held out his hand quietly and said 2 words. "May I?" Daria understood immediately and produced her military identification card from her left breast pocket with a single smooth motion. The general took it, studied it for 3 seconds, and then turned to face the captain with an expression that communicated an enormous amount without requiring a single syllable of emotion. What followed was not explosive or theatrical. The general did not humiliate the young captain publicly in the way the gathered crowd might have expected or perhaps hoped for. He simply introduced Daria by name and full title to the room, acknowledged her 22 years of service, and noted that she was one of the most decorated operational planners in the division. He then placed her identification card carefully back in her hand, gave the captain a look that contained everything he would say privately at a later time, and offered Daria his arm to escort her to her table. The room exhaled collectively. The orchestra began again, and Daria Holt walked to her seat with the same steady composure she had carried through every room that had ever doubted her. The dinner passed with the formal rhythms of a military social occasion. Toasts were offered, histories were recounted, awards were presented, and the room gradually warmed from ceremony into something more genuinely human and relaxed. Daria sat at her table and engaged the conversations around her with the attentiveness she brought to everything, asking questions, listening fully, sharing observations from her operational experience that the other officers at the table found both useful and surprising in their depth. The brigadier general she had spoken with earlier stopped by her table during the dessert course and squeezed her shoulder briefly without saying anything, a gesture that carried more meaning than most sentences could have managed. The captain who had confronted her was seated 3 tables away. She was aware of his presence the way you are aware of a distant storm on an otherwise clear day, not threatening in this moment, but notable. At one point during the evening their eyes met across the room, and she held his gaze long enough to let him know she saw him, then returned her attention to the conversation at her table without drama or lingering. She would not learn until a week later that he had requested to speak with her privately through official channels, an unusual thing for a junior officer to arrange with someone of her rank. She agreed to the meeting without knowing what he intended to say. He arrived at her office on a Tuesday morning wearing the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed an apology multiple times and still wasn't sure he had it right. He sat in the chair across from her desk, hands folded on his knees, and told her that he had been wrong, that he had acted on an assumption formed from ignorance rather than evidence, and that he understood what that had cost her in front of her peers and colleagues. He told her that after the evening at the ballroom, he had gone home and stayed awake until 3 in the morning reading about her career history, cross-referencing her deployments, her awards, and her assignments, essentially doing the research he should have done before he ever opened his mouth. What he found had left him first embarrassed and then genuinely humbled. Daria listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at him for a moment before she spoke. She told him that she did not need his apology to feel secure in who she was. That security had been built over 22 years and was not dependent on his recognition or anyone else's. But she told him she appreciated that he had come, not because it helped her, but because it suggested he might become a better officer, and better officers meant better soldiers. And better soldiers meant better outcomes for the mission and the people who depended on it. She told him that doubt, properly examined, was not a weakness. It became a weakness only when it was weaponized against someone before the examination happened. She told him to sit with that distinction and carry it forward in every leadership decision he ever made. He left her office looking like a man who had learned something that would take years to fully understand, which was exactly the right way to leave a conversation like that one. In the months that followed the gala, something shifted in the quiet way things sometimes shift when a moment generates more reflection than noise. Several officers who had been present at the ballroom reached out to Daria through professional channels, some to express belated support, some simply to initiate a working relationship they realized they should have pursued earlier. A female captain from the Signal Corps, who had been standing near the edge of the crowd during the confrontation, sent her a brief message that said only, "I needed to see that. Thank you for not flinching." Daria saved the message in a folder on her computer where she kept things that mattered. She was asked to speak at the division's Women's History Month observance that spring, an invitation she initially deflected because she was never entirely comfortable with being held up as a symbol. She was a soldier. She was an officer. Those identities felt more honest to her than any symbolic framing the army or anyone else might want to place around her story. But the sergeant major who extended the invitation was someone whose judgment she trusted, and he made an argument she couldn't dismiss. That her presence in that room saying true things would matter to someone who needed to hear them, and that the soldier she might reach was worth the discomfort of standing at a podium. She agreed. She spoke for 18 minutes, and she did not once mention the ballroom incident or the captain. That was not the story she chose to tell that day. Instead, she talked about her mother working double shifts and showing up to every school event anyway. She talked about the drill sergeant who had told her in week 3 of basic combat training that she was tougher than she believed, and how she had filed that information away and returned to it on difficult days for 20 years. She talked about the soldiers she had sat with in their grief during her first deployment, and about what she had learned from them in return. That service runs in all directions. That leadership is as much about receiving as it is about giving, and that the strongest teams she had ever been part of were the ones where every member felt genuinely seen. She talked about the cost of consistency, how showing up every day without exception and without performance for any particular audience was the most underrated act of leadership she had ever witnessed or practiced. She did not tell people that the road had been easy or that doubt had not sometimes found its way into her own thinking. She told them instead that discipline was not the absence of doubt, but the decision to act correctly while the doubt was still present. She told them that the uniform meant something only as long as the person inside it continued to earn it, and that the earning never stopped, not after a promotion, not after a deployment, not after a recognition, not ever. When she stepped away from the podium, the room was quiet in a way that meant something. And then the applause that followed was the kind that comes from somewhere genuine rather than somewhere polite. Afterward, a young specialist with uncertain eyes waited near the edge of the crowd and finally worked up the courage to approach Daria and ask, "How did you know you were enough?" Daria looked at her for a long moment and said, "I decided to act like I was. And I kept deciding that every day until it stopped being a decision and became a fact." Lieutenant Colonel Daria Holt's story did not end at a military ball in a moment of public vindication. Because real stories never end in single moments, no matter how significant those moments feel. What ended that night was the particular chapter of invisibility, the specific variety of doubt that believes unexamined assumptions are the same as facts. What continued was everything that had always been true. 22 years of quiet, disciplined, purposeful service. A career built not in a single dramatic arc, but in thousands of individual choices made correctly when making them incorrectly would have been easier. The ballroom confrontation was not the defining moment of her life. It was simply the moment that became visible to others, a brief illumination of something that had been burning steadily in the dark for 2 decades. What her story represents is something larger and more universal than one woman's military career. It is a story about what it means to persist with integrity in environments that were not always designed with you in mind. It is about the kind of strength that does not announce itself, that does not require an audience, and that does not diminish when the room refuses to recognize it. It is about the truth that credentials do not create character, they reflect it. Every ribbon on Daria's chest was a record of a decision made under pressure, a responsibility carried fully, a moment where she chose the harder right over the easier wrong. And she had been making those choices since before anyone in that ballroom knew her name. The young specialist who asked how Daria knew she was enough carried that answer with her into the years ahead. She would think about it during a difficult field exercise 2 months later. She would return to it during her first deployment when the weight of responsibility felt disproportionate to her experience. She would share it eventually with soldiers of her own, passing forward something that had been passed forward to her, which is precisely how the best things in any institution survive and grow. And somewhere in that chain of influence, in that continuous movement of hard-won wisdom from one soldier to the next, is the truest measure of a military career. Not the rank attained or the medals awarded, but the lives quietly shaped by a person who chose, every single day, to show up fully and without apology for something worth serving. That is what Daria Holt built over 22 years. That is what no one in that ballroom could take away. And that is the kind of legacy that needs no announcement, because it speaks for itself long after the moment has passed.